Okay, this is my output page for South Carolina History Standard 8-6.3. Explain the reasons for depressed conditions in the textile mills and on farms in South Carolina and other regions of the United States in the 1920s and the impact of these conditions on the coming of the Great Depression. So, there were three main reasons for the Depression of South Carolina. South Carolina really was already in a pretty great depression throughout the 1920s due to less European demand for farm goods. The expression King Cotton is dead definitely applied to South Carolina during the 1920s. There were many reasons for this. As I stated, less demand. You also have the boll weevil and drought, so just some really difficult farming conditions as well. The rest of the world is impacted, not as much as South Carolina, but Europe definitely did not need as much cotton, so there was a lot less demand for cotton after the war. The second main reason we discussed were banks were crashing. So South Carolina farmers, in dealing with the difficult farming conditions and the lack of demand, they took out loans from the banks. Then their farms failed. They were unable to pay back the loans. And then the banks failed because they weren't making any money, and they were stuck with this farmland that they couldn't do anything with. So banks were crashing all over South Carolina. The impact on the rest of the world was that in 1929, the stock market crash was a much bigger surprise to the rest of the country. South Carolinians were already there for the most part. So the third reason for some of the depressed conditions in textile mills and the depressed conditions in South Carolina was these textile businessmen from the north came down and opened mills down in South Carolina. You can see the picture here, right here, Glendale Cotton Mill, Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I should have mentioned earlier, there's a picture of the boll weevil there and a family going through the depression there. That's a South Carolina family. So the textile mills, the owners would move south for the inexpensive labor. They'd participate in practices such as the stretch out, where they'd have longer work days, and the speed up, where they'd speed up the machines. And these mills, they really started to suffer because of overproduction. So they were just trying to produce, and they ended up overproducing, not being able to sell all of their goods. Part of the reason for this was they didn't pay their workers very much, so the workers of South Carolina really had no money to spend on anything produced in these mills. Rest of the world was much less dependent on textile mills, and they did not suffer as much because of diversifying. So up north, out west, you had people participating in other economic activities. In the south, it was really just agricultural, and then the textile mills. Other reasons, you have greed, you have the lost generation of World War I, and you have the bad policy decisions going on at the federal government level. So all of these were reasons for some of the depressed conditions in South Carolina after World War I. So the essential question for the standard was, how did our state status change in the 1920s? So, South Carolina's status dropped very low. We were really an economic drag on much of the country. We were poor, poor education, and luckily we would see some relief for that, but that wouldn't come until the 1930s. So our status change in the 1920s was really we were poorer than we had ever been, and things were not good in the state of South Carolina.